The moment you go silent, he assumes it's only temporary. He believes that no matter how strong you seem, no matter how determined you are, eventually you'll crack. He's convinced that at some point, your emotions will get the best of you, that the silence will become too much to bear, and that you'll be the one to reach out. That's what he's counting on. He's not worried, at least not at first, because in his mind, he still has control. He thinks he knows you. He thinks you're still the same person who used to respond instantly, who used to wait for his attention, who used to give him chance after chance, even when he didn't deserve it. He thinks that deep down, you're still attached, still hoping, still unable to fully walk away. That's why he's not rushing to fix anything. That's why he's not making an effort. Because in his world, you always come back. At first, he's relaxed. He might even act indifferent, pretending that your silence doesn't bother him. He assumes it's just another one of those moments where you're upset, where you're trying to prove a point, where you're making a statement. He's confident that it's only a matter of time before the pattern repeats itself, before you cave in. Send that message, check in on him, show him that you still care. He knows how to play this game because he's played it before. But what happens when this time is different? What happens when you don't come back, when you don't react, when your silence stretches longer than he expected? That's when the doubt begins to creep in. At first, it's subtle. He tells himself you're just being stubborn, that you'll eventually give up the act. Maybe he even jokes about it to himself, laughs at the idea that you could really move on without him. But as the days go by, something starts to feel different. Your absence doesn't just feel like space, it feels like a shift. Like something is actually changing this time. And that's when he starts to wonder, is she really done? He might check his phone a little more often, casually glancing to see if your name pops up. Maybe he starts opening old messages, scrolling through past conversations, trying to remind himself of how things used to be. At first, it's just curiosity. But then, a new feeling starts to set in, discomfort. Because suddenly, for the first time, he's the one waiting. That's the moment when his confidence starts to crack. The control he thought he had, it's slipping, and he doesn't like that. So he does what most people do when they start to feel powerless. He looks for reassurance. Maybe he posts something, hoping you'll react, a cryptic message, a picture, something that might trigger a response. He watches to see if you'll bite, if you'll engage, if you'll show any sign that you're still affected. But when nothing happens, that's when the real panic sets in. Because now he's not just wondering if you're coming back, he's realizing that he has no idea what's going on in your mind. And that drives him crazy. See, people like him thrive on predictability. They like to know they have an option, that even if they push you away, they can still pull you back when they feel like it. But your silence? It's unpredictable. It's something he can't read, can't control, can't manipulate. And the longer it lasts, the more it eats away at him. At first, he might tell himself that you're just trying to prove a point, that you're playing hard to get. Maybe he even convinces himself that you're waiting for him to make a move. But as more time passes and you remain silent, the fear starts to creep in. What if she's really over this? That's when the game starts to turn. That's when the power dynamic shifts. Because the longer you stay quiet, the more desperate he becomes for some kind of sign that he still matters. He might start asking mutual friends about you. He might randomly check your social media looking for clues. He might even try to trigger you by acting like he's moved on, hoping you'll react out of jealousy. But no matter what he does, it all comes from the same place, his growing fear that he lost you. And that's when he starts to regret, not just losing you, but underestimating you. He realizes that he miscalculated, that he assumed you'd always be there, that he took for granted the fact that you cared. And now, for the first time, he's forced to sit with that regret, knowing that he was the one who pushed you away. See, silence is powerful. It forces people to face the reality they tried to avoid. And in his case, that reality is this: you were never the weak one. You were never the one who needed him. It was always the other way around. But by the time he realizes that, it's too late. Because while he was busy waiting for you to break, you were busy rebuilding yourself. While he was hoping you'd reach out, you were moving forward. And while he was stuck wondering if you still cared, you were already done caring. He thrives on predictability. He assumes he knows exactly how you'll react, how long you'll last, how easily you'll give in. He's convinced that even if you go silent for a while, it's just a phase, that sooner or later you'll crack under the weight of your emotions. And that's what keeps him comfortable. Not your absence, not the thought of losing you, but the belief that you'll eventually return. But then something happens that he didn't expect. The silence stretches longer than he anticipated. The usual patterns don't repeat themselves. He doesn't hear from you, doesn't see your name pop up on his phone, doesn't get the reaction he thought was inevitable, and for the first time, a tiny seed of doubt begins to grow in his mind. At first, he shrugs it off. Maybe you're just trying to make a point. Maybe you're waiting for him to make the first move. Maybe you're playing a game of your own. He tells himself that he still has the upper hand, that he's still in control, that nothing has really changed. But as more time passes, that confidence starts to fade. Because if you were really just trying to get his attention, wouldn't you have cracked by now? If you were still the same person who always forgave, always reached out, always tried to fix things, wouldn't you have given him some kind of sign? That's when the uncertainty begins to eat at him. And it's not just about whether or not you'll come back. It's about whether or not he ever really had as much control over you as he thought. People like him operate on one simple truth. They need to feel like they're in charge. They need to believe that they can push you away and still pull you back whenever they choose. That they can ignore you, play games, keep you waiting, and still have you right there when they finally decide they're ready. But now he's starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, you're not waiting anymore. And that terrifies him. He starts checking your social media, scrolling through your old messages, trying to pick up on any clues that might tell him where your head is at. He wonders if you're thinking about him, if you miss him, if you're waiting for him to do something. And then a darker thought crosses his mind. What if you don't care at all anymore? That thought alone is enough to shake him. Because the one thing he never prepared for was you actually moving on. He was ready for silence, ready for some distance, even ready for you to act like you were over it, but only temporarily. He expected it to be a game, something that would eventually bring you back to him. But the more time passes, the more it starts to feel like this isn't a game at all. This time it's real. And suddenly he's not so sure of himself anymore. That's when the overthinking begins. He replays old conversations, tries to pinpoint the exact moment things shifted. He wonders if he misread the situation, if he underestimated you, if he let something slip away that he wasn't supposed to lose. And the longer he stays in his own head, the more the fear grows. The fear that he's no longer in control. That fear is what keeps him up at night. That fear is what makes him want to reach out, to say something, to test the waters, just to see if you'll still respond. But he hesitates because deep down, he knows that the moment he reaches out, he's admitting something he never wanted to admit, that he needs your attention more than you ever needed his. And that realization, that's how it finally makes him suffer. When you remove yourself entirely from his life, there's an inevitable shift that forces him to face his own reflection in a way he's never dared to before. Without your presence to cushion his ego, without your responses to validate his actions, he finds himself alone with his thoughts. Thoughts that are raw, unfiltered, and uncomfortably honest. In the past, you were the constant in his day, a reliable source of affirmation that allowed him to feel in control, important, and above all, needed. Now, that lifeline is gone, and the silence that remains is both a mirror and a magnifying glass, exposing every insecurity and every flaw he has long tried to ignore. At first, he might try to fill the void with distractions, checking his phone obsessively, scrolling through old messages, or even seeking out similar interactions elsewhere. Yet nothing seems to quite replace the steady reassurance he once took for granted. In those moments of forced solitude, he begins to realize that his need for your validation wasn't a measure of your importance to him, but rather a reflection of his own inner void. The constant buzz of your messages, the routine of your interactions were not signs of deep connection, but temporary salves for his insecurities. Now, in the absence of your engagement, he is left with nothing but the stark reality that he built his sense of self-worth on something that was never truly his to own. Every day that passes in silence deepens his introspection. He starts questioning the very foundations of his behavior, wondering how it came to be that he relied so heavily on your attention for his emotional survival. It's a slow, painful process, a gradual unwrapping of layers he thought were impervious. In the quiet, he hears the echo of every missed opportunity, every instance where his actions were driven by the need to control and manipulate rather than to genuinely connect. The absence of your replies is like a persistent reminder that his influence was not as all-encompassing as he once believed. Instead, it was a fragile construct, easily shattered when the source of his validation is removed. With each passing day, the isolation begins to gnaw at him. Without you there to reinforce his sense of importance, he finds that the noise in his mind grows louder. The habitual reach for your contact becomes a jarring reminder of what's missing, and slowly, the realization dawns that he has been relying on you to prop up an image, a carefully constructed persona of control and dominance. This image he now sees was nothing more than a mirage. It offered him comfort and a fleeting sense of power, but it was built on a foundation of dependence that crumbled the moment you walked away. And now, he is left to confront that painful truth, that his sense of self was never truly his own, but a product of the constant, albeit one-sided, attention you provided. In the quiet of these moments, he begins to reflect on the countless times he assumed your presence was guaranteed. He recalls the days when your words, however brief, were enough to validate his every decision, when your availability was the baseline against which he measured his worth. Now, that baseline has disappeared, replaced by a void that is as intimidating as it is enlightening. As he sifts through the remnants of your past interactions, he starts to see patterns. Small instances where his behavior was less about genuine care and more about asserting control over a situation he believed he owned. The silence you've imposed is no longer just a break in communication. It is a powerful catalyst for introspection, urging him to confront the reality that he has been living in a self-created bubble of entitlement and complacency. The more time he spends in this unrelenting quiet, the more the truth seeps in. You were never the problem. The problem was his inability to see that his own value was independent of your constant validation. In your absence, he must reckon with the fact that his identity was tied to an illusion, one that made him believe that he could command attention and loyalty with little effort, that he could always manipulate the situation to his favor. Now, stripped of that illusion, every moment of silence becomes a lesson in humility. It forces him to understand that the control he once took for granted was an illusion, and that his power was never inherent, but borrowed, a fragile construct that vanished the moment you chose to break the cycle. In this journey of introspection, there comes a turning point where he is forced to ask himself the difficult questions. Who am I without the constant reassurance? What does it mean to truly feel valuable when the source of that value is no longer within reach? It's a confrontation with his own vulnerabilities, a recognition that his reliance on you was never a sign of deep connection, but rather an admission of his own insecurities. The silence, relentless and unyielding, pushes him into a space where self-reliance is not just an option, but a necessity. Every day, as he faces the void left by your absence, he is compelled to rebuild himself from the ground up. This time with a foundation that is independent of external validation. The process is neither swift nor painless. There are moments when the old habits and the familiar pull of seeking your attention resurface, threatening to drag him back into the cycle of dependence. But with each passing day, he learns to resist. He learns that the true measure of his strength is not in his ability to manipulate a relationship, but in his capacity to stand alone, to find worth in himself rather than in the fleeting affirmation of another. The once unbearable silence gradually transforms from a source of anxiety into a powerful teacher, one that instructs him on the value of self-sufficiency and the importance of cultivating inner strength.